A lot of wrench turning going on here the last couple of days. Finally got the parts for bottle rockets rear end yesterday, so came here last night, put this thing together. I made the mistake of painting it while it was raining out last night, so it's still all tacky. I can't quite put it in the car yet, but we'll get this in either tonight or tomorrow morning. But I know I'm not supposed to be getting into our long-term Valiant build, right? You guys you've seen that, right? But I can't help it. I'm excited by the car, you know? Not only does it look cool, it's a cool concept, it's something fun, it's something different, but also I'm finally getting back to my roots. So you guys have been following this channel, see that almost everything we've done for the last 2 years has been slant 6 and 318 and stuff like that. And the reason for that is because we're trying to keep things as basic, bread and butter. We're going for like the simplest, most affordable, attainable things out there for you guys who are really just trying to get started. And also, you know, it's fun to make an unlikely thing work, you know, go fast, you know. So we're having fun with that. But, okay, so people ask me all the time, what's your favorite engine? And it's always a toss-up in my mind between the 340 and the 383. This is the 383 that we're putting in a Valiant. And like I said, this thing's eating up a big part of my head right now, even though it's not supposed to. Now that I've put my hands back on one of these things, I'm remembering all of the reasons why I fell in love with it and why hands down the 383 is my favorite engine. So, for you guys that aren't familiar with these things, the 383 is part of the Big Block Mopar family. Let's go really to the basics. The Big Block Mopar was introduced in 1958 and it ran through 1978. The first year there was a 383, but it was a tall deck 383. Well, let's go even back to that. The Big Block Mopar family is broken into 2 groups. You've got the B engine, the low deck, which is the original 350, the 361, the 383, and the 400. And then you've got the RB, the tall deck motors. And those are the 413, the 426 wedge, 426 Hemi, and 440. The first year 383 was an RB. 1959, they did the low deck 383. And they also introduced the 361. So out of these engines, the low deck motor, the 361, 383, and the 400, I just want to focus on the 383. The 361 was basically a truck engine. It was used in passenger cars up until 1966, and then it became exclusively a truck motor. And it actually has a distinction of outliving the rest of the Big Block Mopar family in production use. They stopped casting them in 1978 along with the others. But the government bought up scads of these things and actually used them in amphibious personnel carriers right up until like the middle or the late 1980s. And actually the 361 saw duty in the Gulf War. So it's got that distinction. It's not the best platform for performance use. So it's a good truck motor, it's a good cruiser motor, but it's not something you really want to build. The bore is just a hair too small. The 400 is the darling of the current hot rod Mopar community because it has the biggest bore of all Big Block Mopars. It has a short deck, so it's compact, but it has the largest bore. The 440 has a 4.32 inch bore. The 400 has a 4.34 inch bore. And the common build these days, for the last several years, has been the 440 crank, the 3.75 inch stroke crank in the 400 block, which gives you like a 451, 452, whatever the hell it is. But it's a extremely happy, torquey, responsive combination, especially if you build it with the short rods, the low deck rods. We'll do a whole separate video on the 400. I just want to talk about the 383. So this is a magic engine. Chrysler built 3 million of these things from 59 to 71. By comparison, they built just over 750,000 440s. So these are much more plentiful, easier to find, cheaper when you find them. Every old school Mopar guy has at least 1 or 2 of these things laying around in their backyard or in their shed or whatever. I just found 2 of these in my shed the other day. I completely forgot I had. It's the hoarder's, favorite, one of them. You know, you're going to find the 340, you're going to pay a premium for it. You know, those motors that generally go for $750,000, $1,000 for a good core. 383, you can still pick them up for $100, $200. Complete motors ready to build. So there's the regular production, or the low performance 383 and the high performance 383. But first let's talk about the basics that all of these engines have in common. So let's roll this thing over. In addition to the shorter deck than the RB motor, they also have a smaller main bearing. This is good for two reasons. It takes less oil to keep the small main bearing happy, and also it gives a little extra meat between the crank journal and the cam journal. So, and this is the weak part of all big block Mopars. These are just a little stronger downstairs. There were never any 4-bolt versions of these engines. They were all this deep skirt design. You could say that that Chrysler copied the Ford Y block and then the FE. The FE came out 2 years before the big block Mopar. But it's a solid design. They never had 4 bolts or anything like that. They didn't need them. This webbing right here, extremely strong. In fact, this basic design, this basic layout is still what's in use in today's top fuel cars. And of course, they have multiple cross bolts, but they operate in a whole different situation. You know, that's 10,000, 11,000 horsepower, you know, as opposed to this. So for almost any street application you're going to come across, you can push these things to 600, 700 horsepower if you stay at a detonation, and no problem at all. They're strong, reliable motors. All of the 383s are basically the same casting. In later years, they added these two bosses right here, because when they went to the big block Dart in 1967, the big block A bodies use a different motor mount than all of the others. So these are drilled and tapped, and then the motor mount bracket fits over here like this. All basically the same. There are differences between the HP motor and the standard passenger car motor, and I've got that stuff laid out at the house so I can illustrate the differences there. But yeah, this is it. My favorite, the 383. Let's go to the house and look at some of this other stuff. The 383 is a tough motor. If these things could talk, they'd say, beat me, but I bet you can't break me. And a lot of that has to do with this down here. So all 383s from 1959 to 1970 use the same Ford steel crank. 1971 they went to a cast crank, but it's still a strong crank. I mean, like, you'll never have a problem with one of these things. They all use the same 3.38-inch stroke. They all use the same 6.36-inch long rod, which gives the motor a 1.88 rod ratio, which is actually the longest rod ratio of all big block Mopars, including the 426 Hemi. It has the softest bottom end geometry of all of them. And the 4 1/4 bore piston is relatively lightweight. So they'll go to 6,500, 7,000 RPM with stock pistons, stock bottom end, and you won't have any problems. The passenger car version was, the regular passenger car version was all, they all featured compression ratios in the 8.5 to 1 range. But you're not really interested in the low performance version, right? You want to talk about the hot rod stuff. So, from the beginning, the 383 had performance packages. From 1959 it was available with dual quads. 1960, the long ram setup. Lots of single 4-barrel versions. And in 1962 there was a factory stock eliminator package, the 343 horse 383, which this actually is the top end, the intake manifold and carbs from one of those engines. So that's factory race stuff. But all of that happened before the Musclecar era, before 1964, before, you know, the GTO and the youth market and all of that. So those things are probably, you know, they're kind of like lost to history a little bit. 1965, 66, 67, there was only a single 4-barrel version of the 383, and it was pretty much the only regular performance engine available across the board in Chrysler products. You had the 426 Hemi, of course, but here's the thing you have to understand about the 426 Hemi. They only built about 10,700 of them from 66 to 71. And they were almost more on the street now, on the street. They were almost more of a performance liability than an asset. They didn't have the best reputation. They were a little soft downstairs, big ports, big everything, and especially like a heavy car with a 323 gear or automatic transmission, they didn't really want to get up and go. They were hard to keep in tune, and a lot of guys pushed them to the breaking point because the motors didn't really start to feel good until around 6,500, 7,000 RPM, and at that point they're ready to come unglued. So you saw a lot of these things right from the very beginning with holes in the the side of the block. In fact, that's why you see so many pristine Hemi cars around today, because guys blew them up when they were still new cars, parked them, and then 30, 40, 50 years later, restorers find them, polish them up, and there you go, pristine show car. But the 426 Hemi wasn't really that, The 440 was there, but that 57 cubic inch difference didn't really add up to what you would think it would. 57 cubic inches only equated to around a tenth or two in the quarter mile. The 446 pack came along at the very end, but again, limited production. 446 pack was a stout motor, much better street motor than the 426 Hemi. But it was this. It was the 383 Magnum that earned Chrysler's street cred. The Mopar performance image was basically built around this engine. It's 383 Magnum if it was a Dodge. It was 383 Commando if it was a Plymouth, and 383 Roadrunner engine if it was in a Roadrunner. They rated them at 335 horse in the Roadrunner and the Super B. They also put them in Darts and Barracudas beginning in 1967, and those were rated at 330 horse. I think it was 330 horse. It was a couple of horsepower less because of the more restrictive exhaust manifold. One of the Chrysler advertising things in 1968 was that, for those engines, was that they put the 440 heads on the 383, and that was kind of like it was a little misleading advertising because all big block Chryslers, regardless of cubic inch, got the same cylinder head in 1968, the 906. And this one is a 452. It's a little grungy. This one's a 452, which is a predecessor to the 906. It's an identical head, except it has hardened seats, where the 906 has soft seats. And these are still the choice for guys who want to mess around with, stock castings for whatever reason. These are still the choice to port and make go. But previous to 1968, the 383 was a closed chamber design, right? They used a 516 head, and it has a smaller exhaust valve. It has a 1.6 exhaust valve. It uses a 1.74. But like I said, the Magnum was the beginning of the use of this head. Now also you notice that these things have 5 bolts around each cylinder as opposed to the small block, the 340 and the 318 and all that, which have 4. This has 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it seals a lot better. And if it resembles a small block Chevy head, that's because it really is a small block Chevy head. It's just scaled up. It's almost an exact copy. But this was hot stuff in 1958, 1959 when it was designed, and right up to the end of the Musclecar Era, these things got the job done, and they still do today. Other differences between the standard passenger car 383 and the 383 Magnum or the HP motor was valve springs. The regular passenger car motor uses a single wire spring, and the Magnum used this with the same wire on the outside but used a damper, so it's a double spring. Also, the 383 HP motors used a windage tray. This one is for an aftermarket Hemi, but it's the same exact setup except that the factory one has an opening here for the oil pickup to pass through. But it's got a full width or full length windage tray, and the HP motors used the same oil pump as the bigger high performance motors. The rotor is about 1/4 of an inch taller than on the other ones. So that's all part of the Magnum package. They use the same camshaft as the 440s. And one of the unique things about all big block Chryslers is, these days the air gap manifold is the thing because it insulates the intake manifold from the temperature of the oil splashing up against it. Well, all big block Chryslers are of the air gap design. The intake manifold is held in place with 8 bolts, There were no water crossover passages or anything like that. There is a heat crossover, and blocking off the heat crossover on these engines in particular is extremely effective because it really does isolate the intake manifold, makes it run much cooler. There's like a 25 horsepower difference. I mean, you can really feel it. Very important modification if you're going to build one of these things. Also, one of the benefits of that is they use these Valley Pan Gaskets, which are like eternally reusable. You know, once you got this thing bolted down, you just put a little sealer in the corners, and then you could swap intake manifolds as often as you like. You never have to change them. So one of the things about these engines when they were in production is that they were undercarbureted. From 1965, 1966 until 1970, they used a 625 CFM AVS, which flows only about as much, or they use an AFB at first and then an AVS. And the 6 1/4 Carter only flows about as much as 580 CFM Holly, and the smaller Holly is what they used in 1971. Carburetor, they benefit greatly from carburetor. They eat in 850. It's perfect carburetor for them. And they had very conservative ignition timing. You can quicken the curve a little bit, advance it. You want somewhere around 36 degrees total, and these things really come on. It wakes them up. So how much horsepower can you expect to get out of one of these things? The factory rated them at 335 horsepower. Let me tell you something. It is almost hard to not make 400 horsepower with just the very most basic bolt-ons with these things. Cam, intake, headers, and working the distributor and a carburetor. 400, 425 horsepower, like it's falling out of a tree, even with dead stock cylinder heads. If you're interested in these engines, there's something that I've referred back to 1,000 times. Back in like 2007, 2008, Hot Rod did an intake manifold shootout. It was actually 2 parts, intake manifold shootout on the 383. It was Freiberger and Rob Kinnan wrote this thing, did this. And like I said, I've referred back to it 1,000 times. It's a jewel if you're into 383s. Lots of information to be had there. And you can Google that and find it. It's online. It's the perfect, what they lay out there is exactly what I would recommend for, somebody building a nice street strip 383. And it's pretty much along the lines of the one that we're putting together for ourselves. And I think that's about it. I think we covered all of the bases on these engines. I'm going to try not to get too sidetracked with it, but I'm having fun with it. I'm excited with it. So I said it's going to be a long-term project. I think it's going to be a little bit shorter term than that. I want to get this engine together and start playing around with it, soon, right? I got to get my head back into 318s and slant 6s now for a little while. But that's it. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.